September 19, 1944. 07:30 hours. Near the village of Arracourt, Lorraine, France. A heavy autumn fog lay across the low fields and shallow ridgelines of eastern France, thick enough to swallow sound and distance alike. Visibility in places dropped below 30 meters. Engines idled low. Crews strained forward through narrow vision blocks, eyes fixed on a gray emptiness that offered no reference points, no horizon, no warning. Inside a Panther tank of the 113th Panzer Brigade, Unteroffizier Karl Hoffmann stood half exposed in the commander's cupola, his gloved hands resting on the rim. He had fought on the Eastern Front. He had faced T-34s at Kursk, watched KV-1s burn at close range, and learned what armored combat meant when survival depended on armor thickness and gunpowder. Nothing in his training prepared him for what he had just seen. For a fraction of a second, the fog had thinned. Out of that brief opening had come the unmistakable shape of an American armored vehicle. It appeared suddenly, moving far faster than any tracked vehicle Hoffmann had ever encountered. Two flashes followed almost immediately. The vehicle vanished back into the fog before Hoffmann could shout a warning, before his gunner could begin traversing the turret. To Hoffmann's left, less than 50 meters away, another Panther was already burning. Flames vented from the engine deck. Ammunition cooked off inside the hull, sending sharp metallic cracks into the fog. The wreck was proof that what Hoffmann had glimpsed was not imagination, not confusion, not nerves. The 113th Panzer Brigade had entered the attack that morning with 42 Panther tanks. These were not ad hoc formations or exhausted remnants. The brigade had been formed only weeks earlier, on September 4th, 1944, and committed to combat on September 16th. Its crews included veterans withdrawn from the Eastern Front, men who had fought the Red Army at its strongest and survived. They believed they understood armored warfare better than any enemy they faced in the West. They had been told, repeatedly and with confidence, that American armored forces were inferior, that U.S. tanks were thin-skinned, hastily manufactured, and mechanically crude, that American crews relied on numbers rather than skill, that U.S. doctrine emphasized mass over maneuver and lacked the operational finesse of German panzer tactics refined since 1939. The Panther itself embodied that belief. Introduced in 1943, it mounted a high-velocity 75mm Kabul Bobo K-42 gun capable of penetrating Allied armor at long range. Its sloped frontal armor, up to 80 millimeters thick on the glacis and 100 millimeters on the turret face, could defeat most Allied anti-tank weapons when properly angled. Weighing approximately 45 tons, it was the product of Germany's hard-earned experience against Soviet armor, a machine designed to dominate the battlefield through superior firepower and protection. Against such a vehicle, American tanks were expected to fail quickly. Sherman tanks, the Germans believed, could be destroyed at distance with impunity. American tank destroyers, when acknowledged at all, were assumed to be lightly armored, slow to react, and dependent on ambush rather than maneuver. What the crews of the 113th Panzer Brigade encountered in the fog around Arracourt violated every one of those assumptions. The vehicle that had struck and disappeared was not a tank in the German sense at all. It carried little armor by comparison. Its silhouette was low, its turret light, its sides vulnerable to almost any anti-tank round. But it possessed something the Panther did not: speed on a scale that German doctrine had never seriously considered possible for a tracked fighting vehicle. The Americans called it the M18 Hellcat. At the moment of first contact, most German crews did not know its name. Some referred to it in after-action reports simply as a fast tank or new American vehicle. Others described it as a reconnaissance tank armed with an unusually powerful gun. The reality would become clear only after repeated engagements, and by then the damage was already done. The assumption that governed German armored warfare in 1944 was simple and deeply ingrained. Protection and firepower were the decisive attributes of a tank. Speed mattered, but only insofar as it supported operational movement and exploitation after breakthrough. In combat, survivability meant armor thickness. Victory came from destroying the enemy before he could penetrate that armor. This assumption had held true through Poland, France, and the early stages of the war in the Soviet Union. Even when German tanks were technically inferior, superior training and tactics had compensated. When the Soviets introduced the T-34, Germany responded by building heavier, better-armed vehicles. Each step forward was evolutionary: thicker armor, larger guns, more complex machines. By 1944, the Panther represented the apex of that evolution. American doctrine had taken a different path. The roots of that divergence stretched back to December 1941, when the United States entered the war and began absorbing the lessons of German blitzkrieg with an analytical rather than imitative eye. At Fort Meade, Maryland, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce commanded the newly formed Tank Destroyer Center. Bruce was not a traditional cavalry officer shaped by interwar armored theory. He approached the problem as an engineer and organizer. Studying German operations in Poland and France, Bruce drew a conclusion that challenged prevailing orthodoxy. Tanks, he argued, did not need to fight tanks head-on. Attempting to match enemy armor with heavier armor led inevitably to escalating weight, complexity, and logistical burden. Instead, Bruce proposed a force designed to counter armored breakthroughs through speed and maneuver rather than brute protection. The priorities were explicit: speed first, firepower second, crew efficiency third, armor protection, traditionally the defining feature of tank design, ranked last. In German terms, this bordered on heresy. The Ordnance Department issued requirements for a fast tank destroyer that emphasized mobility above all else. Early designs featured torsion bar suspension, a continental or right radial engine, and initially a 37mm gun. Prototypes evolved rapidly as battlefield requirements changed, leading eventually to the T-70 gun motor carriage, armed with a 76mm gun comparable in penetration to the Sherman's later models. By July 1943, production began at Buick's plant in Flint, Michigan. What emerged was a vehicle unlike anything fielded by Germany, powered by a 9-cylinder Wright R975 radial aircraft engine producing between 350 and 400 horsepower. The M18 weighed roughly 20 tons, nearly half the mass of a Panther. That power-to-weight ratio transformed its performance. On roads, the M18 could reach speeds of 55 miles per hour, approximately 89 kilometers per hour, with some reports indicating up to 60 miles per hour under ideal conditions. More importantly, it could maintain speeds of 40 miles per hour across broken terrain, where heavier tanks were forced to slow dramatically. The Panther's maximum road speed of roughly 46 kilometers per hour appeared respectable on paper. In practice, its acceleration was slow, its mechanical systems stressed by weight, and its cross-country speed, often limited to 10 to 15 miles per hour to avoid breakdowns. None of this was widely understood by German units in France in September 1944. The first combat use of the M18 had occurred earlier that year in Italy, when 5 T-70 models were issued to the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion at the Anzio beachhead. The mountainous terrain and narrow roads of Italy masked the vehicle's full potential. Engagements were limited, lessons localized, and German intelligence failed to draw broader conclusions. As a result, when American forces broke out of Normandy and raced eastward in August and September 1944, German planners continued to frame the threat in familiar terms. They expected massed Sherman formations supported by slower tank destroyers, such as the M10. These vehicles, while mobile by Allied standards, still operated within parameters German doctrine understood. The fog-shrouded fields near Arracourt presented a different reality. On the morning of September the 19th, German Panthers advanced cautiously at approximately 5 miles per hour, engines throttled low to reduce noise and maintain control in limited visibility. Crews scanned for Shermans. They expected long-range engagements, deliberate target acquisition, and time to bring superior firepower to bear. Instead, they encountered an enemy that refused to fight on those terms. The M18 Hellcat did not seek frontal duels. It exploited concealment, then burst into motion with acceleration no Panther could match. From a standstill, an M18 could reach 30 miles per hour in seconds. A Panther required nearly half a minute to achieve similar speed under ideal conditions. In the fog, that disparity became lethal. German turret traverse systems compounded the problem. The Panther's turret, weighing nearly 7 tons, relied on a hydraulic traverse driven by engine power. At low engine revolutions, common in ambush situations, full turret rotation could take up to 60 seconds. The M18's turret, weighing just over 2 tons, traversed far faster, allowing rapid target acquisition in any direction. What Hoffmann and his fellow commanders faced that morning was not simply a new vehicle, but a collapse of expectation. The battlefield no longer behaved according to the rules they had mastered. Engagement ranges collapsed. Angles shifted unpredictably. Threats appeared, fired, and vanished before German crews could react. The assumption that armor equaled survivability no longer held. As the fog lingered over Lorraine, German Panther crews confronted a form of armored warfare they had not trained for, not equipped themselves to counter, and not imagined possible. The M18 Hellcat was not stronger than the Panther. It was not better protected. It was something far more dangerous. It was faster than certainty. And on that morning near Arracourt, speed was about to rewrite the balance of armored combat in Western Europe. The encounter near Arracourt did not occur in isolation. It was the visible edge of a deeper structural divide between two military systems that had reached radically different conclusions about how modern war should be fought. For Germany, armored warfare had always been a question of dominance at the point of contact. From the 1st Panzer divisions assembled in the late 1930s, German doctrine treated the tank as the decisive arm, the armored spearhead that shattered enemy defenses through concentrated force. Speed mattered, but only insofar as it allowed penetration and exploitation. Once contact was made, survival depended on armor thickness and the ability to destroy the enemy before he could respond. This logic shaped every stage of German tank development. The Panzer III, armed initially with a 37mm gun and protected by modest armor, proved effective in Poland and France. When it encountered heavier Allied tanks and improved anti-tank guns, it was replaced by the Panzer IV, then overtaken by the Panther. Each new design addressed battlefield shortcomings by adding weight, thicker armor, and more powerful guns. The progression was linear, deliberate, and technically ambitious. The Panther, introduced in 1943, weighed approximately 45 tons and mounted frontal armor sloped at 55 degrees to maximize effective thickness. Its long-barreled 75mm gun could penetrate most Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. In German doctrine, such a vehicle was expected to dominate any engagement it entered, provided it was properly handled and supported. This expectation was reinforced by experience. On the Eastern Front, German crews had learned that speed alone did not guarantee survival. Soviet tanks could be fast, but when caught in the open, armor and firepower decided the outcome. The Panther emerged as the answer to the T-34, a machine designed to outmatch it in every measurable category except simplicity. American thinking followed a different path. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its armored forces were small and doctrinally unsettled. Rather than attempt to copy German designs, American planners dissected German operations and separated tactical effects from technological mystique. What they saw was not merely heavy tanks winning battles, but systems, logistics, communications, training, and coordination, creating conditions for success. At the Tank Destroyer Center at Fort Meade, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce examined German blitzkrieg and reached a conclusion that challenged traditional tank-on-tank logic. He observed that German successes often came not from direct duels between armored formations, but from maneuver, surprise, and concentration against vulnerable points. Heavy tanks were effective, but also costly, slow to replace, and mechanically demanding. Bruce proposed a counterforce designed to respond to armored breakthroughs rather than initiate them. Tank destroyers would be held in reserve, deployed rapidly to threaten sectors, and tasked with destroying enemy armor through maneuver rather than frontal engagement. Instead of matching tanks with tanks, the Americans would create a specialized force optimized for speed and flexibility. This concept was codified in Field Manual 18-5 and refined throughout 1942 and 1943. Tank destroyers were not intended to fight pitched battles head-on. They were to move quickly, strike from the flanks or rear, and displace immediately before the enemy could respond. Mobility was not a secondary characteristic. It was the defining one. To support this doctrine, the vehicle itself had to be radically different. The Ordnance Department issued specifications for a fast tank destroyer that placed speed above protection. Early prototypes explored various armaments, including a 37mm gun, but combat experience soon demanded greater firepower. The design evolved through several iterations, culminating in the T-70 gun motor carriage, armed with a 76mm M1 gun capable of defeating German medium tanks from the side and rear. What made the T-70, and later the M18, distinct was not simply its gun, but the system built around it. The vehicle was powered by a Wright R975 9-cylinder radial engine, originally developed for aircraft. Producing between 350 and 400 horsepower, it was the same engine used in the M4 Sherman, but installed in a chassis weighing roughly 20 tons instead of 33. This produced a power-to-weight ratio unmatched by any armored fighting vehicle in Europe. The suspension system further reinforced this advantage. The M18 used torsion bars, providing a smoother ride at high speeds and better performance over broken terrain. German tanks relied on either leaf springs or complex interleaved road wheels, which distributed weight effectively but limited sustained high-speed travel across rough ground. The transmission represented another divergence. The M18 employed an automatic torque converter transmission derived from Buick's civilian automotive designs. This allowed rapid acceleration without complex gear changes, enabling drivers to focus on maneuver rather than mechanical management. Panther drivers, by contrast, wrestled with manual gearboxes that required careful timing and double clutching, particularly under stress. The result was a vehicle that behaved less like a traditional tank and more like a high-performance machine optimized for rapid reaction. The origins of the M18 reflected this philosophy. The design emerged from Harley Earl's studio at the Buick Motor Division of General Motors. Earl, renowned for shaping American automotive aesthetics, brought a civilian engineering mindset to military production. The emphasis was on efficiency, accessibility, and ease of manufacture rather than artisanal precision. This had profound implications. German tanks were essentially hand-built. The Panther's Maybach engine required skilled craftsmen. Final drive assemblies were complex and sensitive to tolerances. Each vehicle demanded approximately 2,000 man-hours to produce, using specialized tools and materials increasingly scarce by 1944. The M18, by contrast, could be assembled in roughly 500 man-hours. Wherever possible, standard automotive components were used. Engines were mounted on steel rollers, allowing maintenance crews to disconnect and remove them rapidly. A trained crew could replace an entire engine in under 2 hours, a task that could immobilize a Panther for a full day or longer. These differences were invisible on the battlefield, but they shaped everything that followed. The M18's first combat deployment occurred in Italy in early 1944, when 5 T-70 models were issued to the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion at the Anzio beachhead. Italy's mountainous terrain limited the vehicle's ability to exploit speed, but even there, crews noted its responsiveness and reliability. Engagements remained small, and German units did not encounter the Hellcat in sufficient numbers to force doctrinal reassessment. As a result, German intelligence assessments in France remained anchored in outdated assumptions. In preparation for the Allied advance following the Normandy breakout, German planners focused on the threat posed by massed Sherman formations, supported by tank destroyers such as the M10. These vehicles, while more mobile than German tanks, still conformed to familiar patterns. They were slower, manually traversed, and reliant on static ambush positions. The M18 represented something else entirely. By September 1944, when the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion joined the U.S. 4th Armored Division, near Arracourt, its crews had spent months refining tactics designed to exploit the Hellcat's unique characteristics. They trained to deploy rapidly, coordinate by radio, and operate as teams rather than individual hunters. Speed was treated as both offense and defense. Every M18 carried an SCR 508 FM radio set, providing reliable voice communication between vehicles and with supporting units. This allowed platoons to coordinate movements in real time, vectoring one another onto targets and warning of threats. German Panther platoons typically operated with a single radio, leaving most crews dependent on signal flags or prearranged maneuvers ill-suited to fluid combat. The difference in communication multiplied the difference in speed. Where German doctrine emphasized deliberate movement and controlled engagement, American tank destroyer doctrine embraced fluidity. Fix one element, maneuver another, strike from multiple directions, then displace before retaliation. This was not improvisation. It was the logical extension of a system designed around mobility. The Panther was the product of evolutionary refinement. The M18 was the result of revolutionary thinking. Both vehicles were technically impressive. Both reflected deep study of prior combat experience, but they embodied opposing answers to the same question: how to survive and win in armored warfare. By September 1944, these two systems were about to collide in the fog-covered fields of Lorraine. The result would expose not just a difference in machines, but a difference in how each nation understood war itself. By the time the 113th Panzer Brigade reached Lorraine in mid-September 1944, the German armored force was already operating on borrowed assumptions. On paper, the Western Front appeared forgiving compared to the East. The Red Army had broken through in the summer offensives of 1944 with overwhelming mass, artillery saturation, and relentless pressure. France, by contrast, seemed a more familiar battle space: rolling terrain, defined road networks, and an enemy long dismissed as tactically inferior. German commanders believed that, with well-handled Panther formations, they could stabilize the front, blunt American advances, and restore operational coherence. What they underestimated were the fractures already spreading through their own system. The 113th Panzer Brigade was formed on September 4, 1944, an emergency response to the collapse following the Allied breakout from Normandy. It was rushed into service with 42 Panther tanks and a mix of veteran and replacement crews. Many of its tank commanders had fought at Kursk, Kharkov, and along the Dnieper. Their instincts were shaped by battles where engagements unfolded at distance and where armor and gunpowder decided outcomes. These men knew how to fight tanks. What they did not know was how to fight speed. German training manuals and combat experience had never seriously addressed the problem of an enemy that could choose when to engage and disengage at will. Reconnaissance vehicles could be fast, but lightly armed. Tanks could be powerful, but relatively slow. The assumption that no tracked vehicle could combine serious firepower with extreme mobility was so deeply ingrained that it went unchallenged. Early warning signs existed. In Italy, scattered German reports had noted unusually fast American vehicles operating in limited engagements. Some described light tanks appearing unexpectedly, firing from the flank, and withdrawing before counterfire could be brought to bear. These reports were filed, but not prioritized. The terrain in Italy was considered atypical. The numbers involved were small. No doctrinal revisions followed. German intelligence assessments in France remained focused on the M4 Sherman and the M10 Tank Destroyer. The Sherman, though numerous, was judged inferior in armor and gun performance. The M10, with its open-topped turret and manual traverse, was seen as a marginal threat when properly engaged. The M18 Hellcat did not fit any existing category. By September 1944, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been operating in Northwest Europe long enough to internalize the Hellcat's strengths and limitations. Originally trained on the M3 gun motor carriage, the battalion had undergone extensive testing and refinement before receiving production M18s. Its crews were not learning on the battlefield. They were executing rehearsed techniques. They understood that the Hellcat could not survive a frontal exchange. Its armor, barely sufficient to stop small arms fire, offered little protection against even light anti-tank weapons. Survival depended entirely on movement, concealment, and coordination. The battalion trained relentlessly on these principles. Crews practiced rapid deployment from concealed positions, firing on the move, and immediate displacement after engagement. Platoon leaders emphasized situational awareness and radio discipline. Every engagement was treated as a timed problem. Seconds mattered. These practices contrasted sharply with German expectations. When the 113th Panzer Brigade advanced toward Arracourt on the morning of September 19th, it did so under conditions that magnified every weakness in German assumptions. Thick fog reduced visibility to less than 30 meters in many areas. Air reconnaissance was useless. Ground observation was limited to fleeting shapes and engine noise. German intelligence had identified American units in the area, including elements of the U.S. 4th Armored Division. Sherman tanks were expected. No significant anti-tank defenses were reported. The mission was straightforward: push through the American screen, exploit into the rear, and disrupt logistics. At approximately 07:15 hours, as German Panthers advanced cautiously through the fog at roughly 5 miles per hour, Lieutenant Edwin Leiper's platoon of 4 M18 Hellcats from Company C was already in position near Rechicourt-la-Petite. The Hellcats had moved into place before dawn, engines idling, crews scanning assigned sectors through periscopes and vision blocks. Leiper himself was positioned forward, observing the approaches toward Moncourt. The fog concealed both sides equally, but this favored the force that could react faster. The first indication of German presence came not from sight, but from sound. The low, distinctive rumble of Maybach engines drifted through the mist. Moments later, Leiper saw the dark outline of a Panther's gun muzzle emerge from the fog barely 30 feet away. There was no time for deliberation. Leiper immediately deployed his platoon. Orders were transmitted by radio in clear, concise commands, practiced dozens of times in training. The Hellcats did not wait for the enemy to fully reveal himself. They acted on partial information, trusting speed to compensate for uncertainty. The Germans' first awareness of the Hellcats' presence came not from muzzle flashes, but from noise. An M18 roared to life from a complete stop, its right radial engine accelerating with startling immediacy. Within seconds, it reached 30 miles per hour, an acceleration that would have taken a Panther nearly half a minute under ideal conditions. The Hellcat burst from concealment, crossed open ground, and swung toward the Panther's flank. Before the German gunner could traverse the turret halfway toward the threat, 2 76mm rounds struck the Panther's side armor. The tank erupted in flame. The Hellcat did not pause to observe the result. It disappeared back into the fog, relocating before return fire could be attempted. This pattern repeated itself across the engagement area. In a 5-minute period, 5 Panther tanks of the 113th Panzer Brigade were knocked out. The Americans lost 1 M18. To German commanders observing fragmentary reports, the losses were incomprehensible. Panthers were not supposed to die this quickly, not without warning, not without prolonged engagement. The fracture in German assumptions widened as the morning progressed. German crews struggled to identify targets. Fog reduced visibility. Turret traverse lagged behind fleeting contacts. Panthers designed for deliberate, controlled combat found themselves reacting to threats that appeared and vanished, without remaining in view long enough to engage. Attempts to pursue only made matters worse. Several Panthers suffered mechanical failures during short bursts of acceleration. Final drive components, already stressed by the vehicle's weight, failed under rapid maneuver. Transmissions overheated. Tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they could no longer move. By contrast, Hellcat crews reported minimal mechanical issues. Vehicles ran continuously through the morning, displacing repeatedly without loss of performance. Maintenance demands remained low, even under combat conditions. As the fog began to thin around 0900 hours, the full shape of American tactics emerged. The Hellcats were not operating as isolated hunters. They moved as coordinated elements, using radio communication to fix German attention in one sector while other platoons maneuvered into position. Under the direction of Captain Tom Evans, Company C deliberately exposed one platoon to draw German fire, while 2 others advanced along concealed routes toward the flanks. This was not opportunistic improvisation. It was tank destroyer doctrine executed with precision. German units lacked the reconnaissance and communications needed to counter such maneuver. Panthers operated largely in isolation, each commander dependent on what he could see through his own optics. Radio coverage was uneven. Coordination between vehicles broke down under pressure. By midday on September 19th, the attack of the 113th Panzer Brigade had stalled. American forces continued to engage methodically, striking from unexpected angles, then displacing before counterattack. The Panthers' theoretical superiority in armor and firepower was rendered irrelevant by an enemy that refused to remain in front of them. What German commanders faced was not simply tactical surprise, but the unraveling of a belief system. The early fractures were now unmistakable. The rules they had trained to master no longer applied. The battlefield had changed, and they were discovering that change only after the first Panthers were already burning. As the fog lifted over Lorraine on the morning of September 19, 1944, the battlefield around Arracourt revealed a pattern that German commanders struggled to comprehend. What they saw was not a conventional armored engagement. There were no clear lines, no sustained exchanges of fire, no opportunity to bring the Panthers' theoretical advantages to bear. Instead, the battlefield appeared fragmented, chaotic, and deeply unsettling. Tanks burned in isolated clusters. Crews reported being hit from directions they had not observed moments earlier. Contact reports contradicted one another. The enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. This was the point at which the German system began to fail under its own assumptions. The Panther had been designed to dominate space through presence. Its long-range gun and heavy frontal armor assumed that enemies would be detected, engaged, and destroyed at distance. The vehicle's entire architecture, from turret weight to crew layout, reflected this expectation. The Panther was not meant to chase fleeting targets. It was meant to impose control. The M18 Hellcat did not allow that control to exist. By mid-morning, American tank destroyer platoons were operating with increasing confidence. The initial surprise had passed, but the Germans still lacked an effective response. Hellcat crews now exploited not just speed, but rhythm. Engagements followed a predictable cycle: rapid approach, short exposure, precise fire, immediate displacement. No single Hellcat lingered long enough to be targeted effectively. The mechanical realities of the two vehicles amplified this imbalance. The Panther's turret weighed nearly 7 tons, armored to withstand frontal hits from Allied guns. Its hydraulic traverse system depended on engine speed. At low revolutions, common when advancing cautiously or lying in wait, turret rotation slowed dramatically. Under ideal conditions, a full rotation could take up to 60 seconds. In practice, it was often slower. The M18's turret weighed just over 2 tons. Its traverse system allowed rapid target acquisition in any direction. Crews could engage threats within seconds of detection. Against an enemy that relied on speed and surprise, this difference proved decisive. German attempts to respond with aggression only deepened the crisis. When Panthers attempted to pursue Hellcats, they encountered a second, more insidious problem: reliability. The Panther's final drive assembly, inherited from lighter vehicles, was overstressed by the tank's weight. Rapid acceleration and abrupt changes in direction increased the likelihood of failure. During the engagements around Arracourt, several Panthers were immobilized not by enemy fire, but by mechanical breakdowns during attempted pursuit. Abandoned tanks littered the field, their crews forced to withdraw under fire or capture. Each immobilized Panther represented not just a tactical loss, but a logistical catastrophe. Recovery under combat conditions was often impossible. Vehicles left behind were typically destroyed by their own crews or captured intact. The Hellcat, by contrast, demonstrated exceptional mechanical endurance. Crew reports indicated that M18s could operate for hundreds of miles under combat conditions with minimal maintenance. The air-cooled Wright R975 engine, though loud, proved robust and forgiving. The automatic transmission reduced driver fatigue and mechanical stress. The torsion bar suspension allowed sustained high-speed movement over terrain that forced Panthers to slow drastically or risk throwing tracks. As the morning progressed, American coordination became increasingly sophisticated. Under Captain Tom Evans, Company C of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion employed deliberate deception. One platoon exposed itself just enough to draw German attention and fire. Panthers oriented their turrets toward this apparent threat, committing their limited traverse and observation capabilities. Meanwhile, 2 other platoons maneuvered unseen through folds in the terrain, guided by radio communication. This was tank destroyer doctrine in its purest form: fix the enemy, maneuver against his flank, strike decisively, displace immediately. German crews, trained to fight what they could see, found themselves reacting too late. Panthers that turned to engage one threat exposed their side armor to another. Attempts to reposition only increased vulnerability during movement. The Germans lacked the radio density and tactical flexibility to coordinate counter-maneuvers under such conditions. By noon on September 19th, the results were unmistakable. American platoons continued to fire and displace, destroying approximately 10 additional German tanks while losing 2 more M18s. One Hellcat, commanded by Sergeant Henry R. Hartmann, knocked out 6 German tanks, most of them Panthers. His actions were not the result of reckless courage, but disciplined application of Hellcat tactics, using terrain to mask approach, firing at vulnerable points, and relocating immediately after each engagement. The arithmetic of the battle stunned German commanders. Each Panther cost approximately 117,100 Reichsmarks and required nearly 2,000 man-hours to build. Each M18 cost roughly $50,700 and could be assembled in a fraction of the time. Panthers represented months of skilled labor and scarce materials. Hellcats represented industrial throughput and replaceability. By the afternoon, German tactical errors compounded material disadvantage. Lacking effective reconnaissance, Panther units advanced blindly into kill zones shaped by American combined arms coordination. Shermans, previously dismissed as secondary threats, exploited the situation. Using the thinning fog for concealment, Sherman tanks maneuvered into exposed positions and knocked out 11 additional German tanks by targeting side armor already weakened by Hellcat attacks. The Germans were no longer fighting a single type of enemy. They were confronting a system. That system extended beyond individual vehicles. American armored infantry, engineers, artillery, and tank destroyers operated as an integrated force. Thinly held salients around Arracourt masked depth and flexibility. The Hellcats served as the mobile striking element within this larger structure, responding rapidly to threats and opportunities as they emerged. German doctrine, built around concentrated armored force, struggled to adapt. Attempts to form static defensive pairs, Panthers positioned back-to-back to cover all angles, surrendered initiative entirely. Such formations assumed reliable communication and mutual support, neither of which could be sustained under constant pressure from mobile attackers. Worse still, static Panthers became vulnerable to artillery and air attack once identified. Psychological strain followed mechanical and tactical failure. These were crews who had survived Kursk, who believed they understood armored combat at its most brutal. The Panther had been their reassurance, a machine that restored confidence after the shock of encountering the T-34. Now, that confidence eroded with every unexplained loss, every report of an unseen enemy, every breakdown that left a tank helpless in the open. The Hellcat exploited not just physical weaknesses, but mental ones. Its speed created uncertainty. German crews could hear engines approaching from multiple directions, but could not predict where contact would occur. Even when Hellcats were detected, their rapid displacement denied closure. There was no decisive exchange, no moment of mastery. By the evening of September 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade's attack had collapsed. What began as a confident advance by 42 Panthers ended as a fragmented, reactive struggle to survive. Losses mounted. Momentum vanished. German commanders faced an enemy that had inverted every assumption on which their training and equipment were based. Armor no longer guaranteed survival. Firepower no longer ensured dominance. Deliberate movement no longer produced control. The collapse under pressure was not sudden. It unfolded minute by minute, engagement by engagement, as each attempted response failed to restore coherence. And as darkness fell over Arracourt, German commanders began to realize that this was not a temporary setback. It was the exposure of a fundamental mismatch. By the morning of September 20th, 1944, the German command structure in Lorraine could no longer dismiss what was happening around Arracourt as chance or isolated misfortune. Reports arriving from the front were consistent in their confusion. Panther units were being engaged by American vehicles of exceptional speed. Pursuit was ineffective. Turret traverse could not keep pace with fleeting targets. Losses were mounting at rates that defied prior experience. Mechanical failures, not enemy fire, were immobilizing tanks at critical moments. For the first time since the war began, German armored doctrine faced a problem it had not anticipated and could not easily solve. The arrival of additional German units only reinforced this realization. On September 20th, elements of the 111th Panzer Brigade entered the battle, attempting to restore momentum and stabilize the front. Instead, they encountered the same pattern of engagement. American tank destroyers struck from unexpected directions, coordinated their movements by radio, and disengaged before counterfire could be brought to bear. German commanders began issuing ad hoc tactical guidance. Some units were ordered to operate Panthers in mutually supporting pairs, positioned back-to-back to cover multiple angles of approach. Others were instructed to hold hull-down positions and wait for the enemy to reveal himself. Both measures represented an implicit admission that the Panther could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. Neither solution worked. Paired formations sacrificed mobility and initiative. Static positions made Panthers predictable and vulnerable to artillery and flanking fire. The underlying problem remained unresolved. German tanks could not respond quickly enough to an enemy that refused to remain in front of them. At the operational level, recognition came slowly but decisively. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, reviewed after-action reports that described American tank destroyers operating with extraordinary speed and unexpected coordination. These were not the words of officers exaggerating defeat. They reflected a growing understanding that the enemy had changed the nature of armored combat. New instructions circulated through German armored units in late September. Enemy tank destroyers of exceptional speed operating in this sector. Do not pursue. Avoid mobile engagement. Engage from prepared positions only. The language was careful, but the implication was unmistakable. The Panther, designed as an offensive weapon to dominate through movement and firepower, was being reduced to a defensive role. German armor was being asked to surrender initiative in order to survive. This adaptation marked a doctrinal failure. German armored warfare had been built on the idea that superior training and superior machines could overcome numerical disadvantage. Now, German tanks were being instructed to avoid engagement with an enemy that was lighter, cheaper, and theoretically inferior. The psychological impact on crews was profound. Veteran tank commanders who had once hunted Soviet armor now found themselves waiting, engines idling, hoping the enemy would choose to appear in front of their guns rather than behind them. American forces, by contrast, continued to adapt in the opposite direction. As the Battle of Arracourt progressed through late September, M18 crews refined their tactics based on combat experience. Hellcats increasingly operated in coordinated groups, using their speed to overwhelm German defenses from multiple directions simultaneously. Platoon leaders emphasized timing and mutual support. Fire and movement became seamless. On the morning of September 22nd, new tactics were employed near Coincourt. M18 sprinted across open ground at maximum speed, covering distances that German gunners could barely process. Panthers caught off guard managed only a few hurried shots before Hellcats were among them, firing into side armor at close range. The speed of approach compressed engagement timelines to seconds, not minutes. The psychological effect on German crews was devastating. They could hear the American engines approaching from a kilometer away. The sound was unmistakable, loud, urgent, relentless. Yet by the time targets appeared in their sights, the engagement was already over. The Hellcats were too fast to track, too unpredictable to anticipate. Mechanical reliability continued to favor the Americans. Hellcat crews reported that their vehicles operated for extended periods without significant maintenance. Minor issues could be addressed quickly in the field. The Panther remained a maintenance burden. Final drive failures persisted. Transmissions overheated under repeated acceleration. Tanks were lost without ever firing a shot. By September 22nd, the 113th Panzer Brigade reported that a significant portion of its losses were due to mechanical failure rather than enemy action. This was not simply a matter of bad luck. It was a consequence of design philosophy colliding with operational reality. American industry had optimized for reliability and replaceability. German industry had optimized for performance at the edge of mechanical tolerance. The difference became increasingly visible. On September 24th, Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, coordinated a combined attack with the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The plan was simple and effective. Sherman tanks would advance deliberately, drawing German attention and fire. Meanwhile, M18s would infiltrate through wooded terrain and dead ground, positioning themselves for flank attacks. The execution was precise. As Panthers engaged the Shermans at long range, confident in their superior guns and armor, Hellcats burst from concealment at multiple points. German tanks were caught in a crossfire they could not escape. Turrets traversed too slowly. Engines failed under stress. crews abandoned vehicles under fire. By September 25th, senior German commanders could no longer deny the nature of the threat. Losses had reached unsustainable levels. Tactical adaptation had failed to restore control. The Panther, once the embodiment of German armored confidence, had been rendered ineffective against an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules. The recognition was not merely tactical, it was systemic. German officers began to understand that they were not facing a superior tank, but a superior process. The M18 Hellcat was not remarkable because it was invulnerable. It was remarkable because it fit seamlessly into a system of production, maintenance, communication, and doctrine that allowed rapid adaptation. Germany could not replicate this system. Even if German engineers could design a faster vehicle, production constraints, material shortages, and training pipelines made rapid implementation impossible. American factories could replace lost Hellcats in days. German factories struggled to replace Panthers lost in a week. Adaptation, when it came, was defensive and belated. The German armored force had reached a point where it could only react, never initiate. The battlefield belonged to the side that moved faster, not just in kilometers per hour, but in decision cycles, production cycles, and doctrinal flexibility. By the end of September 1944, the outcome around Arracourt was no longer in doubt. The Germans had recognized the problem. They simply could not solve it. When the fighting around Arracourt finally subsided in late September 1944, the tactical results were clear long before the full implications were understood. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 39 German tanks. 4 M18 Hellcats had been knocked out, with 3 more damaged. Against veteran Panther crews and some of Germany's most technically advanced armored vehicles, the Americans had achieved a kill ratio that defied German expectations and validated American doctrine under real combat conditions. Yet Arracourt was not decisive because of numbers alone. Its significance lay in what it revealed about the future of armored warfare and about the war Germany was no longer capable of winning. For German commanders, the battle confirmed a reality that had been forming since the Normandy breakout, but had not yet been fully acknowledged. German armor could no longer impose its will on the battlefield. Even when technically superior on paper, it could be neutralized by an enemy that moved faster, coordinated better, and replaced losses with ease. The Panther had not failed as a machine. It failed as a concept. German armored design had reached the limits of evolutionary improvement. Each generation added weight, complexity, and production cost. The Tiger II, entering service in 1944, represented the logical extreme of this path. 70 tons of steel, armor up to 180 millimeters thick, and a gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at extreme range. It was an engineering achievement and an operational liability. The M18 Hellcat represented the opposite conclusion. It accepted vulnerability as the price of dominance. It relied not on invulnerability, but on the ability to choose when and where to fight. Armor was sufficient only to protect against small arms fire and shell fragments. Survival depended on movement, awareness, and coordination. This philosophy extended beyond the vehicle itself. The Hellcat was embedded in a system that emphasized communication, logistics, and adaptability. Every M18 carried an SCR-508 FM radio, enabling real-time coordination with other vehicles, infantry, artillery, and headquarters. German tanks, often operating with one radio per platoon, could not match this level of integration. Production reinforced the imbalance. M18 production began in July 1943 and ended in October 1944. By that time, 257 units had been built. Peak production occurred in January 1944, when American factories produced approximately 250 Hellcats in a single month. Each vehicle required roughly 500 man-hours to assemble. The Panther, by comparison, required approximately 2,000 man-hours per unit. Even at peak output, German factories produced around 380 Panthers per month across all facilities, serving every front, training unit, and replacement pool simultaneously. Losses at Arracourt alone represented more than a week of Germany's maximum output. The disparity in replacement capacity was decisive. American commanders could accept losses as part of maneuver warfare, confident that vehicles could be repaired or replaced quickly. German commanders could not. Each lost Panther reduced future capability in ways that could not be recovered. These realities became even clearer during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When German forces launched their final major offensive in the West, initial surprise and concentration achieved temporary success. But as M18-equipped Tank Destroyer Battalions rushed to critical points, their speed again proved decisive. At Noville, Task Force DSOB of the U.S. 10th Armored Division was assigned to block elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. With only 4 M18s from the 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion in support, the Americans used speed to compensate for limited numbers. The Hellcats reached blocking positions ahead of German spearheads, exploiting road networks and open terrain to arrive where German commanders did not expect opposition. This high-speed deployment represented one of the few documented cases where the Hellcat's maximum road speed was fully exploited operationally. The M18s raced along highways at speeds that German planners had assumed impossible for tracked vehicles, disrupting timetables and forcing premature engagements. Once again, German armor found itself reacting rather than initiating. Throughout the European theater, M18s consistently achieved high effectiveness despite being employed outside their original doctrinal role. Tank destroyer units were often tasked with infantry support, urban fighting, and ad hoc defensive missions. Even under these conditions, the Hellcat maintained a kill-to-loss ratio unmatched by any other American armored fighting vehicle. Across all theaters, M18s claimed 526 enemy vehicles destroyed. Of these, 498 occurred in Europe, 17 in Italy, and 11 in the Pacific. Combat losses totaled 216 vehicles. The overall kill-to-loss ratio stood at approximately 2.4 to 1, with a mechanical readiness rate of 78% under combat conditions. These figures were especially striking given that M18s were not designed primarily for sustained tank combat. They were meant to counter breakthroughs, not lead assaults. Yet even when misemployed, they delivered results. The contrast with German armored philosophy was stark. German designers had sought perfection through refinement. Better optics, thicker armor, more powerful guns. Each improvement came at the cost of increased weight, mechanical stress, and production complexity. The Panther and Tiger II represented the pinnacle of this approach and its endpoint. American designers chose revolution over evolution. Rather than attempting to build a better traditional tank, they questioned the premise of the traditional tank itself. The M18 embodied a simple but radical idea. The best armor is not being hit at all. This lesson did not end in 1945. During the Korean War, 650 early production M18 chassis were converted into M39 armored utility vehicles by removing the turret and fitting seating for up to 8 men. The continued use of the chassis demonstrated the durability and flexibility of the design. More revealing were the assessments made by former German officers in the post-war period. Serving as advisors to the newly formed West German Bundeswehr in the 1950s, many argued against the pursuit of heavy tanks and in favor of mobile, flexible armored systems inspired by American wartime experience. Their conclusions were shaped not by theory, but by memory. The psychological impact of the Hellcat lingered long after the war. German veterans consistently ranked the M18 as the most feared American armored vehicle they faced, ahead of the M26 Pershing or even tank-killing aircraft such as the P-47 Thunderbolt. The fear was not of its gun or armor, but of its unpredictability. The hunters had become the hunted. At a veterans gathering near Arracourt in 1985, Former German and American soldiers walked the fields where the battle had unfolded 4 decades earlier. A restored M18 Hellcat was demonstrated, accelerating across open ground at speeds that still seemed implausible for a tracked vehicle. German veterans watched in silence, many recognizing the sound immediately. They did not need explanation. The story of the M18 Hellcat is not simply one of tactical success or technological novelty. It represents a moment when an entire philosophy of warfare was challenged by a fundamentally different approach. German armored doctrine, perfected through years of combat, encountered an enemy that refused to play by its rules. The Hellcat did more than destroy tanks. It destroyed certainty. In the fog at Arracourt and across the battlefields of Europe, German tank crews learned that armor and firepower alone were no longer enough. Speed, coordination, and adaptability had become decisive. With a top speed of 55 to 60 miles per hour and a 76mm gun, the M18 Hellcat demonstrated that in modern warfare, survival and victory belonged not to the heaviest machine, but to the system that could think, move, and adapt the fastest.